Welcome to the second seminar held by the cross-party Campaign for an Independent Britain, as we make ready for Britain to leave the European Union. Our objective today is to consider strategy, aims and opportunities now that the EU referendum genie is truly out of the bottle. How do we get through the EU's door marked exit? What are the opportunities on the other side? We also hope to build a wider consent and courage in public opinion for the principle of independence, and to form a realistic cooperation between the many and various groups in the independent movement. First speaker today is Daniel Hodson. Daniel is the Honorary Treasurer of Business for Britain, a name of which we will hear much more. He is Chairman of the Executive Committee of the People's Pledge, the campaign which encourages MPs, very forcefully, of all parties and views to commit to an EU referendum. He's Chairman of BPL Holdings, former Gresham Professor of Commerce, Chairman of the Design and Artist Copyright Society, Chief Executive Officer of LIF, Deputy CEO of Nationwide Building Society, Chairman of Davidson Pierce Group, and Financial Director of Unigate. So, Daniel, please.
Thank you so much, Edward. Good morning, everybody. Well, my plan today is to give you a tour d'horizon as seen through the eyes of one campaigner for a shift in the tectonic plates that bind Britain to Europe. I intend to talk about the work and success of the People's Pledge, which is driven for an in-out referendum on British membership of the EU, and which I've been, as you said, Executive Chairman for the last few months, although I have to add that I am now not, because my own role has moved on to Business for Britain. And also explain why the pledge was necessary, and then to move on to Business for Britain, of which I'm Honorary Treasurer. And Business for Britain aims to counter the pro-European business lobby and to set the agenda for the political debate following the Prime Minister's recent and seminal speech to which you referred. And also describe the likely scenarios that we face as we move forward, with a particular emphasis on the city and financial services, the industry that you'll see from my CV that I know best. And, Chairman, I'm also mindful of the time limits that have been placed on me to ensure that we can have that debate in a timely framework, and wise preachers will always tell you the secret of an excellent sermon is to have a good beginning and a good ending, and to have the two as close together as possible. Little bit of audience participation. Some, but not all of you, will have had the opportunity to vote in the 1975 Harold Wilson-inspired referendum. I look around, I think I may be flattering some. I just want to ask you three questions. How many of you voted on that occasion? Most people in the room, but not everybody. And how many of you voted yes?
Yes to what? Yes,
Yes,
to coming out?
yes to staying in. To
staying in.
Staying in.
Yeah.
Nobody.
No, I voted yes.
But, yeah, okay. And would you still vote yes, answer no?
The reasons for that are... well, no, I'm going to...
Well, perhaps I should go on to say that I think that most of us who voted yes, and I was one of them, I have to say, felt that the idea of a common market involving free trade, the dismantling of tariff wars and restrictive practices, and asserting Europeanness in the face of the Cold War was enough to tempt us. But perhaps those who did vote will not recall, and I don't recall, perhaps you don't recall, sir, the 16-page leaflet which every household received on that occasion, which attempted to reassure doubters about the potential loss of sovereignty, pointing to the universal veto and how the, quote, essence, unquote, which is an interesting word, of our sovereignty would be preserved for our membership, putting us in a better position to, quote, advance and protect our national interests. Looking back, it was a pretty stinky argument. And I have to say that I, for one, did not spot it at the time. I think that the majority of people who did vote thought that we were voting for an economic advantage to our nation, but not for radical constitutional change. The giving up over the years of our national veto as part of the bargaining over progressive treaties and ceding Westminster's sovereignty on a creeping basis to a constitutional colossus in Brussels, based on an approach to democracy with rather different traditions to our own. It reminds me of Mahatma Gandhi's famous remark about when asked about what he thought of modern civilization, to which he said he thought that it would be a good idea. So, for us poor dupes, if one could wave a magic wand, what would the ideal situation be? Well, if I were to define one type of typical mainstream supporter of both the People's Pledge and Business of Britain, it would be someone who said, let's go back to 1975 and keep the political and constitutional superstructure we looked at then. Such a person would, emotionally and with the normal human anathema for radical change, prefer to stay within the EU, provided it delivered what he wanted. It would also be someone who would be open-minded about our leaving the EU if nirvana were not forthcoming within, with a trade treaty-based relationship outside, akin to what is loosely called the Swiss-Norway solution, but provided the benefits were made clear and fears allayed. There are, of course, other typical supporters on either side of that characteristic person. Nearer perhaps to CIB objectives, we one who wants a straight break with the EU and with limited patience for renegotiation, as proposed in the PM's speech. Or at the other extreme are those who don't really want to leave the EU, but are A, Democrats, hence their support for the People's Pledge, and B, supportive of the maximum pressure for a radical change in our relationship, but within the EU. The reason that I've drawn a picture of this mainstream supporter is not just because it happens to be where I personally stand on the issue, nor because such people provide a substantial amount of the financial support for any Eurosceptic campaign, which they do, but because they are the ones who must be convinced by and supportive of the tactics and messages communicated in that campaign. Let me put this as bluntly as I can. These are the floating opinion formers in this argument, and in particular in a finely balanced in-out referendum, and they will be key to winning it. The first stage in the current campaign has been the People's Pledge, which in its brief existence has had a profound effect on political attitudes. It was formed only as recently as the beginning of 2011 as a single-issue campaign with the objectives of obtaining an in-out referendum and with the support of membership of all mainstream political parties and all shades of Euro opinion. One immediate question, or issue, was the nature of the question for which we were campaigning, and a number of complicated, even rambling formulae came forward, a different one for everybody who attempted to formulate it. The issue of the wording of referendum questions is a cottage industry in its own right, but the founding fathers of the pledge stuck to the concept of a straight in-out question, not just of the need for a one-size-fits-all approach with such a diverse group of supporters that the pledge enjoyed, but also that only an in or out view would sharpen people's minds, in the view of Europhiles, sufficiently to put them off voting out, or, in the view of Eurosceptics, provide the nuclear weapon, actual or threatened, to make radical changes in our relationship with Europe. The campaign itself had two objectives: winning over parliamentarians to put pressure on party leaders, and obtaining a high degree of credible grassroots support, and again, across all shades of Euro opinion. Why, you may ask, would pro-European individuals, particularly elected representatives with party and personal agendas to manage, want to support an in-out referendum? The answer is partly about membership. The answer is partly about democracy. That is, an acceptance that the EU constitutional structure has come a very long way in eroding British sovereignty since the last direct endorsement of the British voting public in 1975, and that what has come to be called the democratic deficit has to be eliminated. But also about certainty, that the vote would be yes, and that the issue can therefore be got out of the way once and for all. And I put it to you, and I shall return to this, that if there were to be an in-out referendum today, the chances are, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other people who think about these things, very high that the British people would indeed vote to stay in, even before any kind of referendum. Let me make an observation at this point. In this sort of campaign, we're all prepared to play in different positions, but with certain specializations, a bit like football. In my case, my specialization is fundraising. And of course, one of the benefits of this, although asking for money is never fun, is that you get to hear not only what people's particular enthusiasms are for the cause and where you're going wrong, but also why they won't support you. You'd be amazed at the number of people who refused to go along with the People's Pledge on the grounds that, of course, they believed in democracy. But the problem was that the people would give the wrong answer. That almost made me sympathetic with the former US President Dan Quayle, who was a little verbally challenged, who once said, "Solutions are not the answer." In parliamentary terms, the pledge has now close to 90 MPs who have publicly, on video, so there's no chance about it, signed up, mainly Conservative Eurosceptics, an increasing number of Labour supporters, interestingly split about 50-50 between Europhiles and Eurosceptics, and a couple of Lib Dems. Although these statistics are not headline-grabbing, they are keenly felt by the whips offices of the two main parties, and there's no doubt that their recent influence on there's no doubt about their recent influence on party policy development. At the same time, the pledge has signed up 130,000 individuals, many of them as a result of 3 well-publicised mini-referendums in politically diverse constituencies. One in Thurrock, an Essex Tory marginal, in May last year, and 2 more in 2 Lib Dem seats in Greater Manchester, Cheadle and Hazel Grove, in August last year. The results in all 3 cases were fascinating. A turnout of registered voters, under the auspices of the Electoral Reform Society, greater than experienced in local elections, with 9 out of 10, yes, 9 out of 10 voters in favour of an in-out referendum. Although there will be some atypical constituencies, there is no reason that this is not a pattern that will not be obtained in other parts of the UK, at least south of the border. One can conclude that, on the whole, and all other things being equal, the British people overwhelmingly want an in-out referendum. This would have substantially reassured the late, great Tony Hancock, who once asked rather balefully, "Does Magna Carta mean nothing to you? Did she die in vain?" We believe, and it's been confirmed from our Westminster sources, that our work had a measurable impact on David Cameron's decision to try to renegotiate the terms of our membership of the EU and to hold an in-out referendum on the resultant package after the next election. A result like this would have been hard to imagine less than 2 years after we set out on the road. There is, of course, one imponderable, or perhaps not, looking at recent opinion polls. How likely is it that the Tories will be re-elected? And if they are, how could such a pledge lie in any ensuing coalition negotiations? So whilst a major milestone has been passed on the long road to changing our relationship with the rest of Europe, the spotlight now falls on the Labour Party. We are therefore working closely with an organisation which probably all of you will be familiar, called the Labour Euro Safeguards Campaign, and John Mills is chairman and will be talking later on in this seminar, to set up a parallel but separate Labour organisation called Labour for a Referendum, whose objective is to continue to make the case for an in-out referendum and to focus on Labour MPs and supporters. It's clear that David Miliband is instinctively pro-European and is only slowly coming round to the idea that it would be politically expedient in due course for the opposition to follow the PM's lead. In this, he will be driven by key figures in the Labour Party, such as Ed Balls and John Cruddas, and by the grassroots pressure exerted by Labour for a referendum, which interestingly is taking very much the same Euro-neutral approach adopted by the People's Pledge in its activities. The run-up to the 2014 European elections will be a key period, and the decision will be influenced by the concomitant opinion polls, which are likely to show the massive impact of UKIP on voting patterns in that election. On balance, then, we think that the Labour Party will be committed to some form of renegotiation/referendum package before the 2015 general election. However, we are now faced with a situation where the pro-European lobby is vocal and assertive in the face of certain support for renegotiation and a referendum from the Tories, and a likely policy change from the Labour Party. In the meantime, we have the 2014 elections and an interesting but important event due next spring, William Hague's so-called review of competencies. This is likely to be a political statement within the framework of the 5 principles of renegotiation which David Cameron set out in his speech, and of course no doubt highly influenced by the Foreign Secretary's power base within the diplomatic service, which some people think, like the BBC, tends to have pro-European tendencies. Just to remind you, those 5 things were competitiveness, flexibility, the two-way flow of power in sovereign terms, democratic accountability, having regard to different political systems and traditions, and fairness between those in and out of the Eurozone. Those were the 5. The combination of these principles and the review of competencies will no doubt in the PM's mind be progenitors of the red lines which will govern his renegotiation attempt. However, until recently there was no real national campaigning organisation to carry the flag for the Eurosceptic point of view. What we are calling the For Britain campaign is therefore setting about the essential task of creating a new organisation which aims to counter the pro-European business lobby and to set the agenda for the political debate which, as you say, Chairman, has already started. These are, of course, the opening shots in something which might last 5 years. That is to well after the next general election, although it could perhaps be much shorter. In any event, our immediate objective is to establish the key issues from a European viewpoint, as well as painting a detailed and hopefully attractive picture of what life with looser ties to the EU might be like. In this, a key concern will be, for obvious political reasons, undoubtedly the conservation and creation of jobs. Employment will probably be the main issue, particularly in these times of economic recession, for so many people whose hearts and minds we have to win over. We aim, in effect, to take the initiative in the debate using 3 independent arms. One focusing on business in the city, called Business for Britain, one on grassroots campaigning, called For Britain, and the third in the form of the aforementioned Labour for a Referendum, essential to help pressurise the opposition into coming out in favour of an in-out referendum. With the deadline of the publication of Hague's review of competences, our first task will be to communicate and ingrain in the public mind the hurdles by which successful renegotiation might be judged, that they are clear and understood, and they will, of course, be our essential red lines. Our first task will therefore to make sure that our red lines will be those by which the competency review is judged. And I'm glad to say we have a very impressive team led by Matthew Elliott, who many of you know, I'm sure, and who ran the highly successful No to AV campaign, and was also the founder of the Taxpayers Alliance. Some of those red lines will undoubtedly concern our country's most successful financial industry of financial services, which happens to be the sector which I know best. There are many reasons why the city and financial services generally could prosper with looser links, and I therefore make no apologies for plagiarising a defence that I recently made as lead speaker in opposition in the city debate to the motion, "The city risks disaster if the UK continues to disengage from Europe." Just to be sure, how many of you attended that event? Oh, good. You won't have to turn off for the jokes. For those who didn't, we won the debate in that more people, and interestingly still a slight minority, and that is interesting, this was a city audience, there was a minority only who voted against the motion, but there were more who voted against the motion before than after the debate, so on that score we won. What I said on that occasion was as follows. For over 1,000 years, the city has been at the heart of British industry and European trade. Today it is, deservedly and despite recent blips, still the world's financial centre. Indeed, it is the main powerhouse of Britain's most important industry, financial services, which employs 1.3 million people and earns £40 billion per annum in invisible earnings, £40 billion. Contrast that, by the way, with the 55 billion that is the so-called trade deficit in our trade with the EU. In fact, it is the jewel in the crown of the world's 6th largest importer. We are still the 6th largest importer, if you include invisible earnings. Yet only 14% of Britain's GDP is exported to Europe. And I heard Robert Peston on the radio last night, perhaps you did, perhaps others of you did, saying it was 30%, which is complete rubbish. And that percentage, of course, is heading firmly south. Furthermore, according to no less than the IMF, the EU's share of world GDP, 30% in 1980, is forecast to fall to 17% in 2017, compared with the famous BRIC economies of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which will have risen threefold from 11% in 1980 to over 30% by 2017. In an overlapping parallel, the Commonwealth, if there is such a thing, the Commonwealth nations, including, of course, India, will soon account for a greater share of world GDP than the whole of the EU, and their populations are going up whilst Europe's are declining, the latter with fewer workers and more pensioners to be supported. These statistics are particularly important in the context of jobs, since the main line of attack of the pro-European lobby appears at the moment to be a suggestion that a démarche from the EU would endanger some 3 million jobs. And in fact, we are a nation who is a massive importer of, for instance, German and French cars. Is it really likely that the Germans and French would be party to a bilateral trade war if we were in any way radically to change our relationship with the EU? These jobs are frankly much more in danger to a flatlining EU economy than to political action. So, like their city and British forefathers, our children will be looking for business where it's to be found, and frankly, that will be overwhelmingly outside the EU. I have a vision that they could be living in a Europe that will in effect have two parts: a low growth, inflexible, over-regulated, centralised, German-dominated Eurozone, and a looser, outward-looking, increasingly wealthy, British-oriented European free trade area. I shall go on to that as a final vision later on. Serving the growth markets of the rest of the world. Two Europes, in fact, although still joined at the ankle by trading agreements. I'm reminded of François Mitterrand's celebrated quip about the prospect of German reunification. I like Germany so much that I would like there to be two of them. Which I echo. I said that, the opposer, I have to say, the opposer in this debate was a senior German politician. He didn't laugh at that. I like Europe so much, I personally like Europe so much, that I would like there to be two of them, not least for the benefit of the next generation. Many of the deep foundations that have made the city great cannot be assailed, even by cunning bureaucrats. Its language, its time zone, and London itself. A recent City Corps report showed that London, despite the weather, was the most desirable city in the world in which to live, and was projected to remain in that position in 10 years' time, whilst its continental rivals dropped down the tables. London is, quite simply, a wonderful, cultured, exciting place to exist, and it draws people of the highest professional skills from all over the world to work in city markets because they want to be here, to add to our diverse and well-skilled British human resources. So far, so good. But let's turn to the rule of law, currently an unrivaled asset and underpinning the attractiveness of our financial markets. Consider this sinister fact, which may be familiar to many of you. The final arbiter in our legal system is moving quietly and inexorably from our Supreme Court, with its distinguished and brilliant members, to the European Court of Justice, where we can appoint only one of 27 judges, many of the others of whom are elected political appointments with mere law degrees at the most. What a wonderful example of ditching a pan-European asset for levelling down to mere mediocrity. It reminds me of the chairman of the US Senate, who when asked if he prayed for the senators said, "No, I look at the senators and I pray for the country." Regulation is where the real madness takes over, however, driven in part, one must add, by the green-eyed monster. As one who ran an exchange which was the envy of Paris and Frankfurt, I can recognize the symptoms of jealousy. What else are the proposed financial transactions tax, the short-selling bans, and now the proposal to cap bonuses? Oh, and don't let's forget the Working Time Directive. And the tragedy is that it won't generate more business for Paris or Frankfurt, or indeed the EU, but merely for the gnomes of Zurich, who are rubbing their little hands in glee. Cutting your nose to spite your face in spades. or, in the case of Zurich, more likely diamonds. Indeed, imagine a European directive on the times that a Brussels bureaucrat should keep you waiting for your appointment. What can you do when a French 5 minutes is 10 minutes shorter than a Spanish 5 minutes, but slightly longer than an English 5 minutes, which is usually 10 minutes? British financial services regulation used to be the envy of the world, with its light touch and its market and practitioner involvement, with a prescriptive but high-level and flexible framework. It was a golden age of regulation for whom the curtain started to come down with the infamous seizure of the Bank of England's role as a banking supervisor, the banking supervisor. The City of London needs, deserves, and can once again deliver for the next generation the best regulation in the world, or through the rule of law and the combined market, legal and other professional skills so abundant in it. And this does not require capital or financial resources. But what it definitely does not need is the current inexorable decline into ever more centralized and prescriptive regulation, first in this country and increasingly through EU takeover. And what chance would London have if the Eurozone members can vote as a single majority bloc in the EU Council of Ministers against the interest of the city? And we've seen this in action in the last week or so in relation to bonuses. So I argued at that time, was Margaret Thatcher right when she said that a European superstate will be a blind alley in history, a sentiment you echoed in your introductory remarks? It is, as Chou En-lai once said when asked about the future of the impact of the French Revolution, too early to tell. But do not believe those wonderful folks who tried to bring you the euro when they say the doom lies in further withdrawal. It's the exact opposite. Slip backwards towards further integration with a sluggish, torpid EU, and you'll potentially destroy the supremacy of the city. And let's be absolutely clear. According to the Citicorp report, which I referred to earlier, of the 10 slowest growing economies in the world between 2010 and 2050, 9 will be on the continent of Europe, of whom 7 are in the Eurozone currently, including Germany and France. And the 10th, of course, is Japan. We must look a generation ahead, as I said earlier, and outwards towards the rapidly growing economies of the rest of the world. And let us reconfirm the rule of British law and the well-balanced British approach to regulation. And let us remember that the other assets which give the city its dominance will remain in place whether or not Britain shifts the tectonic plates which bind it to the rest of Europe. That will be a bumpy ride, which will need vision and determination, but it will be right for our children. And that was a digest of what I said, and I make no apology of reading it to you. But I turn back to our campaign, and a key element will be to mobilize granular grassroots support. Our plan is simple, and it's 2 basic elements. There are in existence a number of distinct and important special interest groups, many of the members of which share our concerns about our relationship with Europe. We will be supporting them and bringing them in behind our campaign. Examples might be fishermen for Britain, or farmers for Britain, appropriate enough in this club, Chairman, or even bikers for Britain. An interesting one, in the particular light of where our export focus might be in the future, will leverage the increasing apparent Euroscepticism of Britons originating from the African and Asian Commonwealth, which we might call Commonwealth for Britain. At the same time, we will be building a grassroots organisation of individual supporters, constituency by constituency, to tap and influence the views of people on the ground. In conjunction with the special interest groups, they will form a key part of our effort, not only in the run-up to renegotiation, but in the referendum campaign itself. Now, I want to pause here and make several significant points. And you referred to this too, as a matter of fact, Chairman. The first is that one should not underestimate the immense resources which may be mobilized both in this country and from Brussels to help fight the pro-European cause. The total propaganda fund which you referred to is approximately 2.3 billion euros. Business for Britain and the For Britain campaign as a whole is looking at a modest 6-figure annual budget. We're going to have to fight cleverer, with far greater focus, using every technique available and with great determination. Nor, indeed, should one underestimate the difficulties of changing the status quo, as the Yes to AV campaign has found, having started well ahead in the polls, and the substantial barriers created by the political bias that is said to exist in key institutions, notably, as I've said before, in the BBC and the Foreign Office. But perhaps the most important point is this. There will perhaps be a number of people in this audience who are inclined to say that the renegotiation process is a sham, is bound to fail, and we ought to go immediately to an in-out referendum. I actually take the opposite view, believing the situation in which we find ourselves now, and the opportunity to set out and communicate the Eurosceptic case clearly and succinctly, and to bust the Europhile myths in the run-up to and after the process of renegotiation, is an essential and critical part of the road towards getting real change in Europe. I go back to my earlier statement that in-out referendum would probably be lost. We need the opportunity that the next few years afford to make an irrefutable and well-understood case. It is an essential part of getting successfully to the end of our journey. And I'm reminded of the wise observation that an Englishman's mind works best when it's almost too late. I'm often asked whether renegotiation will pass any meaningful red line test, in my view, and what might happen if it did. I can say with certainty that renegotiation by a Labour government is very much less likely to achieve success by any serious criteria than a Conservative one. You will have your own views on David Cameron's chances, but my assessment is that the realistic probability of even marginal success, and the technique used successfully by Harold Wilson in 1975, properly doled up and brought up to date, are less than 50%. In this, I emphasize again the importance of convincing one way or another the call back to 1975 support, which exists, I believe, existed for the People's Pledge and the and Business for Britain, although by no means the only supporters, of course. For Britain is a single-issue campaign for radical change. And if one was cynical, one would say that the Labour win in the next election with the Miliband renegotiation would be a better and indeed likelier option than a Cameron one. There has, of course, been considerable talk of a new treaty, possibly anticipation of the European elections. The prospect of this may be receding, but at least it's reopened the discussion and has started to concentrate minds on what changes are desirable, possible, and/or necessary. And we should be in no doubt that any British attempts at renegotiation will be supported by and possibly emulated by several of our continental neighbours. Let me conclude by expanding on this vision. I'm saying we should not for a moment believe that we're alone in these concerns about the European Union. And sometimes we have the impression perhaps that we are, but we aren't. Even in Germany, there is beginning to be significant revulsion at both political and grassroots level at the continuing cost and responsibilities of being the central economy and lender of last resort of the Eurozone. The current difficulties in Cyprus will only be emphasizing these concerns. The whole Eurozone crisis, in fact, reminds me of another of Margaret Thatcher's political one-liners. The trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. In fact, there is increasing leverage here in renegotiation terms. Germans of the political classes are beginning to see a real probability of an EU without Britain as a member, or at least in a much looser relationship. And the thought of being on their own to deal with the necessary political adroitness, with France on the one hand, and with the ongoing hemorrhaging from the southern European Eurozone economies, must be a sobering one for them. There are also other EU nations who are watching events here with great interest and possibly supportively. It is not therefore impossible to envision the longer-term prospect of a reduced Eurozone, shared perhaps of some of its more northern participants, who might be, alongside Britain, the members of what could be called or described as the Greater European Free Trade Area, or GEFTA, with characteristics akin to the 1975 EEC. Others, like Turkey, Norway or Switzerland, might be drawn into this looser, larger trading bloc. These sort of, as yet blurred visions will no doubt be helpful in focusing German leaders' minds on what might lie ahead without Britain at the heart of the EU. But I'm outstaying my welcome. I'm afraid that I'm beginning to be the opposite of President Calvin Coolidge. A lady at a White House dinner said to President Coolidge, "Mr. President," she said, I've made a bet against a fellow who says that it's impossible to get more than 2 words out of you." To which Coolidge's reply was immediate and conclusive: "You win." I do believe that we're standing at a great crossroads in our nation's history. We're fighting a battle for the future of Europe, similar to that in which our parents and grandparents participated through armed warfare, and at that time, unfortunately, the cost of the death of many millions. And in that sense, we are perhaps lucky, but the responsibilities are no less. This will undoubtedly be a long campaign, but timing and the ability to be flexible in the face of a constantly changing political scenario, both here and on the continent, will be critical. In short, that huge burden of responsibility has indeed been placed on the shoulders of our generation. We at the For Britain campaign are looking forward to playing a significant part in the struggle that lies ahead. It will be hard-pounding, but I'm convinced that we can help to win the battle for radical change in our relationship with the rest of Europe, and to shape a better, more democratic, and more prosperous Britain for our children and grandchildren.